Hi, I want to talk about the two red worksheets that you see on this page. The first one you should have already turned in, and the second one will be your homework later today. However, we're going to talk about all three concepts: rectangles, rhombi, and squares. Rhombi is the plural of rhombus. When you turned in the 6.4 worksheet, some of you had done that prior to today, I got to see some really good guesses on rectangles. Some stuff you already know, some stuff you had to make guesses. And so we're going to talk about some of those things that people had to guess on. And then we'll also talk about rhombi and squares. And the first way we're going to do this is to look at the quadrilateral page in our vocab packet. Why don't you pause this and make your page look exactly like this one. Here's another check mark you should have. And these are check marks in the rectangle column. And if you notice, the check marks from the parallelogram are the exact same check marks that I have so far in the rectangle column. What's going to happen is some of the x's from parallelogram are also going to show up as check marks in the rectangle column. Here's why. Rectangle belongs in this location on this flow chart. And remember that these arrows are very important. The fact that the arrow is going this way rather than going upwards is very important. The arrow facing downward is saying all of the rules from parallelogram apply to rectangles. So anything that was true for a parallelogram is true for a rectangle. Well, I'm going to tell you right now that the word rhombus goes right here, and that the word square goes at the very bottom. So if I just said that all of the rules from parallelogram go to a rectangle, and all those rules go to a rhombus, anything that's checked mark or true about a parallelogram should be check mark or true for rectangle and rhombi. And anything that's going to be check mark for rectangle and rhombi are going to be check mark for square. So I want you to pause this right now and take your best guess at where do you think check marks are going to go based on rectangle and rhombi for squares, and where do you think the check marks are going to be for rhombus. When you're done, start this up again. Here's the top half of the page. Anything that was true for parallelogram is true for every shape below it. So you should have the exact same thing that I do. And for the same reason, the diagonals bisect each other would be checkmarked for all the others. But let's also look at the second column representing the rectangle and things that we know about the rectangle. All sides are congruent. We know that's actually not true. Opposite sides are congruent. It has 4 right angles. Yeah, a rectangle has 4 right angles. Are the diagonals congruent? That was one where it seemed like guessing. People had some mistakes on that. But it is going to end up being true that in a rectangle, the diagonals are congruent. It's not going to be true that those diagonals are perpendicular. They don't intersect each other at right angles, and they don't end up bisecting the angles. All the rules of rectangles trickle down to what word? Well, if I look down here, all the rules of rectangle trickle down to square. So anything that's true for a rectangle is true for a square. So anywhere I see a check mark, put a check mark in for a square. Do that now. Here's where your check mark should be. Let's talk about a rhombus. A rhombus is essentially a square that's been tilted to the side. So it looks kind of like this, where it's a square, so all sides are congruent, but it's been tilted to the side. So what that means is that all sides are congruent, will be true. And if something is true for the rhombus, it's automatically true for the square, because anything here on our rhombus is true for the square. So I automatically can put a check mark there for the square. A rhombus does not have 4 right angles, but we already have that the square does, because anything true for the rectangle was true for the square. Something that will not be true in a rhombus, the diagonals will not be congruent. We'll talk about that a little later. And then we have 2 spots left here. The The diagonals of a rhombus will end up being perpendicular, which means that will also happen in a square. And the diagonals will bisect the angles. So wherever the diagonal hits the angle, it's actually going to cut it in half. And once again, we have that true for a square. So we just filled in 3 columns, and we had been talking about the first column just for about 2 weeks. So that was kind of fast. Let's practice some of this stuff in our notes. I want to start off with the rectangles, and that's going to be on page 10. The problem that I really want to target, though, is at the bottom, talking about the diagonals. For us, it's going to be problem number 4. So we know that we have a rectangle, because it's all us. And I know that from O to Y is 5x minus 2, and Y to G is 3x plus 14. What we had just stated on our checkmark page was that in a rectangle, the diagonals bisect each other. So this checkmark right here tells me the left side and the right side are congruent, or in other words, 5x minus 2 is going to equal 3x plus 14. See if you can solve for x and then answer these 2 questions here. Be careful about what it's asking you. Pause this first. How'd you do? I was able to get that YO is 38 because that's this segment right here. And I was able to get ME is 76 because even though ME is this diagonal that's not given to us, I do know that the diagonals are congruent. So 38 doubled would be OG, so that must be the same as ME. All right, the next one, number 5, is going to be dealing with angles. See how much you can figure out in number 5, and then start this back up again. How did you do on that one? I knew that angle A, the large angle A, had to be a 90-degree angle, so 32 plus x plus 8 had to equal 90 degrees. So that gave me x. And then the other one, HMA, is asking about this angle over here. Because of the fact that I'm told it's a rectangle, I'm not assuming it's 90 degrees. I know it's 90 degrees. Let's go to the next page so that we start targeting rhombi and squares as well. So this is on page 11. And we're going to go to the bottom of the page and look at the 3 ideas we're talking about today: rectangles, rhombi, and squares. And I want you to answer as much of this as you can right now, and then check your answers. If you have questions on any of these, now is the time to stop and ask for some help. What we're going to look at next are the problems at the bottom of the page. Write the best name of the type of quadrilateral shown. Here's what typically happens in these problems is I see people make assumptions. So a lot of people would tell me that the best answer for 11 is a square. But the thing is, in order to have a square, you have to know that all sides are congruent, and you need to know some other information. For instance, maybe you have a right angle or something. The best shape that I can give the name for, so it's the most specific that's allowed without making any assumptions. Well, if I have all sides congruent, that's this one right here. That's a rhombus. Okay, a rhombus is ahead of the square. So the rhombus is the first shape that has all sides congruent without making any other assumptions. So what I'm saying is that the answer to this problem is going to be rhombus. See if you can make guesses on what 12, 13, and 14 are. I've covered up this number 11. It kind of looks like it's part of the problem. It's really just the page number, so be careful about that. After you have your guesses, start this up again. In this one I have 4 congruent sides and I have right angles. That's not true about a rhombus, but it is true about a square. In number 13, that was one of the ways that we just proved parallelograms on our last test. And all I know here is I have 4 right angles. The rectangle would be the most specific shape I could claim for that to be true. Up above, problem number 1, you have very similar questions, except it's in words. So instead of here's a picture, what's the best name that you're allowed to give it? Here's a statement. See if you can figure out your answers for 1, 2, and it's skipping number 3, so 1, 2, and 4. And then check your answers here. These are the only answers. So if you said square for number 1, that's too specific. A square has congruent sides, that's true, but it also requires other things to happen. The most specific shape that you're allowed to name would be rhombus. So here you're trying to answer it with the best possible, and yet you actually kind of feel like you're naming it with the least specific name. But it really is the most specific you can do based off of the information without making assumptions. So 1, 2, and 4, these are the only answers possible. If you have something else, it's incorrect. If you're not sure why, stop this and see if you can get some help. For 5, 6, and 7, there are going to be multiple answers that we can have. See if you can come up with what would be some possible answers. I wrote down all possible answers. Remember that that green symbol means perpendicular. If you just had one of those words in there, that's fantastic. All right, let's actually practice a little bit of these properties on your next page. We're going to go down to number 17 here. Let's look at the properties of a rhombus. And you're given some information. See if you can figure out the 3 questions. What is x, jk, and the perimeter of the shape? And then start it up again when you're ready. If you got these to work out, move on to number 18. It's going to talk about some diagonals. If you didn't get these to work out, when you pause it, you should be asking for some help and then moving on to number 18. But pause this now. Here are the answers. Check those out. Help each other out. Ask questions if you have them. And if you're good to go on those, you're going to work on 19 and 20 next. And when you're ready, start this up again. So pause this now. I'm going to talk about how I got my answers for number 19. I started off looking at this angle right here, and I knew that in a rhombus that's actually a right angle because the diagonals are perpendicular. So that allowed me to figure out that angle x was 45, and I kind of wish that I wanted to know this angle on the other side because for vertical reasons that would also be 45, but unfortunately I didn't know that. So I took other routes to figure out my other angles. I knew that this angle, the big angle ADC, is 84 degrees, and I also knew that in a rhombus, the diagonal is going to bisect the angle. So if the big angle is 84 degrees, that's going to make the little angle 42 degrees. You've got 2 angles in what is really a triangle right here. If you know 2 angles of a triangle, you can figure out the third because you know that the 3 angles add up to what? I hope you're thinking 180 degrees. Well, 42 plus 45 plus 48 would make 180 degrees. And then you see the answers for 20. If you need some help with these, stop and get some help before you move on. If you're good to go with everything, now is an appropriate time to ask for the homework worksheet. Good luck!